Hello, Renegade marketers. As I've referenced on this show many times and crystallized in my new book, well, it's still new, Renegade Marketing, being a CMO today is really, really, really hard. But the successful ones are truly the cool cats of marketing. CATS being an acronym for courageous, artful, thoughtful, and scientific. And lest you think the CATS framework only applies to previous guests, I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, Kerry Ok, the SVP of Marketing at Auth0, which was recently acquired by Okta, both being in the identity authorization space. And we'll learn more about that in a second. But first, welcome, Kerry.
Oh, thanks so much, Drew. Happy to be here.
Let's do this. God bless my 95-year-old dad. He still occasionally will listen to a show and he'll say, what the heck is identity authorization? What are we talking about here? Can you explain what your company does for my dad?
Absolutely. And it's my favorite way. So we make that login box, right? The doorway to the digital world, secure and effortless for any user to access whatever application they're looking to access.
Okay, so the login box being any site I go to. So if he's going to the LAtimes.com or ESPN.com or any of the other places he might visit, that's what we're talking about.
Correct. Absolutely. And over time, as you see that getting better and better and better. So for an example, you go to one of these sites, right? And you see, oh, log in with a fingerprint scan, or log in with Google, or log in a way that's more secure and easier than remembering those long passwords, right? We're the company that helps make that happen.
So we're going to divide the show up into the 4 parts, starting first with courageous strategy. And I want to dive into the strategic thinking that you've gone through. Eventually, we're going to talk about brand, and just in case you were wondering where the show is going, we will be talking about that. But you've been at Auth0 for over 5 years, and maybe you could talk about the evolution of the company's positioning and some of the strategic insights that you found along the way.
As Auth0 was founded, we were founded as an identity company that focused on helping solve identity for developers by developers. So from the very beginning, we had a laser focused prioritization on making this easier for application development teams. And what I would say in that, and that was critical early because we were solving a need in the market, right? But over time, over the last 5 years, we still focus on developers. We still make identity easy for the apps that companies are building. But I think a lot of our strategy has had to expand and evolve to make sure that we're encompassing all of the wide personas, right, that are involved in identity and application building. And so I think that strategy has evolved quite a bit over the last 4 years for Auth0.
And so I'm starting to think about the target audience here, and you've mentioned developers, but developers exist at companies. So if we just took JetBlue, not that, but we'll take an airline, and I am a customer of that airline, and I go to log in. Whoever created that site, that developer, if you will, works for American. And those folks who run that company probably take identity really, really, really seriously. So I first want to make sure that we're still, who makes this purchase decision for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, historically, with identity, there's a problem you have to think about in how we market an identity, in that when identity is done right to an end consumer, to any user, it needs to be invisible. It actually needs to be frictionless. So yes, while they take it seriously, historically, identity sometimes has been an afterthought. Right? Because it's almost, I would say not complete, it's almost like an ingredient marketing strategy, right? Because if we do it right, we make it invisible. So historically, one of the problems with identity is it sits in a different team, under a different organization, under different leadership in all the different companies. So one company, it might be under engineering and application development, and another, it might be under security teams, and another, it might be under IT, and in some, it's under marketing. So it's kind of complex.
Yeah, which gives you a lot of potential target audiences who are going through different processes. Now, you probably heard me rant about this, but each of that, one could argue you could be a different company to each of those individuals because they have different needs. As you're thinking about that, all those audiences, how did you sort of boil it down so there was some common ground so that we had a strategic foundation that we could create a single brand as opposed to multiple brands or a man with 1,000 faces?
So it was very clear from day one with Auth0 that out of all those possible personas, out of all those possible homes, what we cared about the most was making sure that we made identity easier for developers and app dev teams, for those organizations that were building it, right? And so to that point, we built our platform that way, we marketed our platform that way, but we did need to make sure in the messaging that we could tell a tactical, technical story to developers that made their job easier and told a business value story to the CTOs and application leaders to be able to show the business value of what that platform provided.
So I know developers reasonably well. I mean, literally, I don't know, 15, 18 years ago, we were working with IBM on their whole Developer Works program. And one of the things that's so interesting about developers that hasn't changed is they are infamous for ignoring marketing, ignoring messaging, ignoring just about everything because they live in their own world. But when you do get to them and you do get them engaged, they're just so excited if you do it right. So still in this strategic we've got a target audience. We can get to know them really well. What do you think ultimately was an insight that enabled you to sort of go to market with a better brand story?
So early on in the marketing evolution at Auth0, we made the decision that we weren't going to market to developers, and I would call a traditional B2B marketing way. We wanted to be valuable to developers. We wanted to help them learn. We wanted to make their lives easier. And everything that was done was in pursuit of those efforts, right? And so what I would say is, I often hear the cliche, oh, developers don't want to be marketed to. And I don't believe in that. I actually believe strongly in developer marketing. You have to understand the audience, and what developers love is they love learning, and they love discussion, and they love their communities, and they love when you make their life easier, you make application building easier. So we could go into tactics and all of this, but it was very clear to us that was what we needed to do from day one. And the whole focus for the first 2 years wasn't on pipeline building, wasn't on demand gen, it was building trust and relationships with developers.
Love it. And the entire third section of the book, of course, thoughtful execution, that's what we're talking about. Marketing is a value exchange. And, this is the understanding, but we're not using words like messaging. We're not using words like brand story. We're using things like learning and sharing and community building, which is quite different. Okay. Was there any element of courage in this program as you're thinking about it from a strategic standpoint over the last couple of years? You go, yeah, that was a moment where we did something that was just a little bit unexpected.
I think the whole 5 years were based on courage. Like, sorry, I had to laugh for a second. I love this question. I think.
Well, and speak to that, because that's a really interesting thing to be able to say. So what was that courage? What was it? Just the fact that you decided not to market it, but you were going to just become this sort of educational source?
Yeah, I think, I was listening to some of your episodes, and I was listening to one recently around customer experience, and I think it was from Dan Gingiss, but in that episode, he said something to the effect of, a lot of marketers would rather be wrong in the traditional channels than be right in a non-traditional channel. And when I heard that, it resonated with me, because I think from day one, even before I started at Auth0, the whole goal was, we're going to be sometimes wrong and sometimes right, but all in the non-traditional channels. It's all going to be through experimentation and testing, right? And so it takes a lot of courage to be an experiment focused team. And so we wouldn't do all the traditional tactics. We would experiment with things like, we're going to build a website called jwt.io and a handbook, the JWT handbook, and we're going to teach developers how to compete with us. We're going to teach developers how to build identity on their own, and we're going to give them the best tutorials about how to do this. Because when they read that 157-page manual, and what they need to do it right, they're not going to want to build it themselves. And then they're going to do our trial, right? But that's some creative, courageous thinking, right? It was like, we're going to give them the keys for how to compete with us. That's an example I would say that.
No, it's really cool. And I want to come back to that because it's funny how is a difficult part, because getting to a courageous strategy, ultimately it's when you see the execution of that strategy is when the sort of it becomes clear. But I love the idea that you have a really clear sense of what is it and how you want to communicate with these folks, not necessarily where, but how, in terms of the value that you want to deliver. Okay. Last question on the strategy area. Would you say your organization is purpose-driven? And if so, what is that purpose?
I love this question. And I've thought a lot about this. So absolutely purpose-driven organization. And I say this for Auth0, I say this for Okta as a whole. The purpose we are is to enable everyone in the digital world to be able to easily and safely use technology. Now that sounds obvious, right? Okay, sure, anyone can pull up an application or they use their phone. But if you think about it, think about how much friction identity plays in being able to access technology. Usernames, passwords, remembering all those passwords, fear of your accounts being leaked or breached. Our goal, our purpose is to eliminate that friction, also make people feel more secure when they're entering that digital world. And I think that's a really important purpose that we're on, both at Auth0 and Okta.
And I love it. And one of the things I talk about in the book is sort of little p purpose and big P purpose. And there's a little bit of both in yours, in that there's a practical thing is we all want to get onto the websites that we all want to get onto. And the easier it is, the better. And it's pretty clear. And given how many web applications and other applications there are out there, and how many of them we have to access every single day, certainly making that easier is, I might argue, a profoundly important purpose. All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get into artful ideation and a lot more good stuff. So stay with us. Hey, it's Drew. If you don't mind, I'd like to plug CMO Huddles for a second. Launched in 2020, CMO Huddles is an invitation-only subscription service that brings together an elite group of CMOs to share, care, and dare each other to greatness. One CMO described Huddles as timely conversations with smart peers in a trusted environment, while another called it a cross between an expert workshop and a therapy session. If you're a B2B CMO that can share, care, and dare with the best of them, visit cmohuddles.com or hit me up on LinkedIn to see if you qualify for a guest pass. Okay, we're back. We talked about the strategy of targeting developers. We talked about the brand purpose. We're going to now move into artful ideation. And I want to first start with, how do you engage employees and communicate to employees, and how does that impact the way they think about your brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes with our teams, we undervalue how important the role of clarity and communication is with our teams, right? I'm a big believer in consistency and repetition, not just as marketers, but with our internal teams. And so I think the biggest part of the philosophy is we as leaders should take the responsibility to put the same level of care and dedication into our internal comms and our internal leadership as we do to our external marketing and audiences. And that includes creativity, that includes being funny and witty and entertaining and all of that. So I think that for me, that's the most important part of the internal strategy.
And, obviously I talk about that a lot in the book, but I'm curious, what are the barriers and why is this so difficult? I mean, in the research that we did for the book, it was like the CMOs would say that it was important, but then they'd only allow 3 weeks for any kind of internal launch before an external launch. And the other part of it was sort of would drive me crazy is that it's not just about communicating. Sometimes it's about changing the way you do something to support the new promise that you're making. So why is this? Why are employees sort of the afterthought?
I think it's a very simple reason. I think we as leaders, and this just isn't just marketing, I think this is across a lot of executives. I think we have a bias where we undervalue organizational health and we overvalue, we have a sophistication bias where we overvalue, maybe it's innovation or external marketing campaigns or things like that. But the reality is, if we value organizational health, which clear communications and process and change are a component of that, then our teams can be the ones out there innovating and putting creativity into the market and doing that. And we don't have to do as much of that as leaders, right? But I think it feels like we as leaders need to be doing these super sophisticated, super cutting edge things, when really it's quite simple. If we communicate better and we have better process and we have overall better organizational health, that goes a long way in our teams performing better.
Now, sometimes I've heard CMOs say their HR person says, no, I own internal communications. And I've heard that. I find it problematic, but do encourage, and in my book, I talk about this, and a lot of CMOs I've met have bridged that gap somehow, where the HR person finally realized, oh, you're really clever at this. You're better at it than we are. Why don't you help? Or let's partner. But that is something that I've seen a lot of.
Yeah, we both at Auth0 and Auth0, we see it as a partnership, right? They truly, our people teams have expertise in so many areas where we can learn from, both in process and in how things should be approached. But I think, communications is a function most oftenly that sits within marketing. It's what we do, it's what we breathe, it's what we live. So it really, I believe it should be a partnership.
We talk about internal communications. Is there any effort that you've done over the last couple of years where you said, that rocked, that really helped get the employee base excited about the marketing or initiative that you were about to pursue?
Absolutely. This one's specific to the marketing org. So for years, we struggled with our integrated campaign launches internally and getting the various marketing teams excited and using the materials, right, short after launch. We would do a launch meeting, and we believed we'd put everything of value out there to our marketing teams, and then adoption wouldn't be there and things like that. So we did a change a year ago where we decided we're going to do integrated campaign internal launches differently, right? And we were going to value retention and entertainment. So we tried a bunch of different things. The ones that worked the best were when we would turn our launches into trivia contests and internal things where they got to win prizes and they got to play games. The retention levels of what assets we were launching, what the integrated campaigns were composed of, went through the roofs when we made them entertaining, engaging, bi-directional launches.
Amazing. And there you have it. It's, a little gamification goes a long way, particularly if we're dealing with Gen Z and millennials. But I think anybody, and it speaks to this notion, engage me. And you can't bore anybody into learning anything. I mean, and that's an unfortunate truth. Straightforward won't necessarily get you straight away where you want to go. So is there anything else about your sort of, we'll call it artful ideation process, that in this area where we're going from strategy to execution, that the listener should know about, that will help them as they think about their marketing programs?
The one last point on this ideation that I want to talk about, where I've made a lot of mistakes in my career as a marketing leader, is remembering to involve the teams in the ideation process more than we even think we should or could, right? I think the biggest takeaway for me out of the last 3 years is that when we have some big problems to solve on the marketing front, a lot of times we will start off and kick that off in our leadership teams, our marketing leadership teams, and we feel it's our duty to solve this problem and roll it out to the teams. And I think where we've had the biggest breakthroughs in the last few years is when we take those problems to small, effective working groups that are cross-functional and cross-level, and the solutions are always better. So I think we may, as leaders, be the ones who need to make sure it is communicated and it's clear and it's repeated enough and consistent enough that our teams have direction. But often what we're communicating should come from our teams.
And I love that thought for several reasons. One, obviously, so many companies are suffering from retention challenges. And one of the ways to keep people is to involve them. Two, marketing is one of the more fun things that every company does, or people at least perceive it that way, so you can involve them. In my book, I address this in a couple of ways. One, I recommend for every CMO to do a tracking study. It's an employee survey. It's better than a tracking study. We've got 15 standard questions. If anybody wants it, just hit me up on LinkedIn. Happy to share that with you. And it's funny, we're doing that for a client of ours right now. And we're probably at about 60% compliance. And we have enough data that we could use the data. But what I said to the client today was, you know what, keep going, because the part of the purpose is not just to get the information, but to help the employees feel part of the process. And so if you can get to 60, 70, 80%, those extra folks, even if they don't change the data that you're getting back, they will feel connected. So what you're describing is even better, which is after you've done the study and you sort of benchmark where it is use this group of people to solve problems. And in the book, I tell the story of Jeff Perkins and how they do it at Park Mobile and create a whole semi-annual innovation week. And it's just such an untapped, and it's easy to do. But you have to commit to it, and you have to recognize that they're there to solve that problem. Okay, great. We're going to move on. And so we're now in this world of thoughtful execution. And you talked about how you want to deliver value, learning, generate discussion in the community. Talk a little bit about some of the things that you've done for the developer community.
Absolutely. So for these communities of developers, right, we know three things to be true, right? They trust influencers in the developer community. They trust themselves and their ability to test things themselves. And they trust their peers, right? And they trust others. So that is the foundation of how we engage with developers. So what I would say in providing that value, let's first talk about the influencers. What we know about developers is if we're going to engage with them, they won't trust what we as marketers and what we as a company tell them, right? So we created an ambassador community where they want to make the lives of developers easier. So we bring them into our community. We help pay for some of their travel and expenses to go to talks, and we make sure they understand how we can make the identity part of application development easier. And these hundreds of developers across the globe, they go out and they talk about it and they share about it, right? So that's one way, right? The second thing, in terms of like developers trust themselves, we made sure that we didn't do a trial that was marketing focused. It was developer focused. And what I mean by that is it would be easy for marketing to put a bunch of forms in front of them and a bunch of blocks and a bunch of things so we get the data. Instead, anyone can sign up for a trial of Auth0. All they need is just an email address, and they immediately get free access to the product and a bunch of tutorials to help them. And the last thing was they trust the community. So one of the biggest parts we need to do is put thoughtful, useful utility content out there into the developer community to be able to help educate developers around doing identity. So those are kind of the three fundamentals about how we approach the developer community.
It's sort of going back to my developer experience. It's a great group because they will share their opinions. And when they believe in something, they believe it with all their hearts, and they do like to aggregate. And of course, that was harder during COVID. And that created all sorts of challenges. Were you able to support these folks in the pandemic, and how'd you sort of adjust for that?
So we actually flourished during the pandemic. Which is interesting. And what I mean by we grew very, very fast in many different ways during the pandemic. And I think part of the reason for this is because Auth0 always felt from day one, community cannot just exist in person, right? So yes, we would travel out to a bunch of conferences and events and things like that. But more so, we have a blog that gets hundreds of thousands of developer visits every month. And we have online tools that help developers from anywhere in the globe through tutorials and things like that. And so what actually happened for us during the pandemic is once these other channels that they were used to going to for their community were kind of cut off, a whole group of new developers discovered us online because we were already set up and established to be able to help them out. So from that perspective, we were able to double down on programs that already existed to help our developer communities.
Now, one of the things, again, there's content and there's content, there's lots of blog posts and so forth. How do you make sure that the blog content is developer worthy?
So I think about a third of the team members in our marketing team are developers who've come over to the other side, right? And I think actually when I joined Auth0 back in 2016, I think I was the 10th marketing employee, and I was the first marketing employee that had a traditional marketing background. All other 9 were developers who were doing this. And that's key because you have to really understand your audience, right? So number one, we have developers on the team who are going to hold ourselves to really high standards for what developers deserve, right? The second thing in what it is it has to be specific, it has to be technical, and it has to be useful, right? So we're not going to abstractly, theoretically tell developers about, if they want to add authentication to an application using Python. We can't be theoretical about that. We have to be specific, and we have to be able to give them a tutorial of exactly how they can do it and make sure it's useful. So there's a lot more that goes into it, but I think those are the basics and the foundations of how you separate yourself from a lot of marketing fluff out there, a lot of
yes.
BS in these blogs, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Specific, technical, and useful. You can only do that if you come from a place, as you described it, of knowledge. And so you can't fake that. You either know it or you don't. And so having a team of developers in-house who are in marketing really is it seems so obvious, but I don't know if that's the case at every one of these companies that targets this group. Okay. So at the beginning, actually before you and I started recording, we talked about brand and your feeling about the importance of brand. And we haven't really talked about it that much to this point. So let's get at it from a brand standpoint. When you look at some of the things that you did for Auth0, what are we talking about here? Yeah.
So brand has been critical and foundational to Auth0's success from the very beginning. And what I would say is I think we had 3 cycles of evolution in the history of Auth0 getting to where we, are today, right? The first few years was investment in the developer brand. And that's what I've been talking about so far, right? Producing a bunch of high utility, high value technical assets, both in the digital and physical communities to make sure that we were valuable and known to developers, right? Phase 2, which happened starting in probably 2016, 2017, was layering on that developer brand with a more traditional marketing motion. And that allowed us to be able to extend our developer brand into becoming a real mature business, right? That could speak to all different personas across app dev orgs and the company, right? And so that was huge. What was most critical in the last 2 years was our third phase, which was our investment in broader brand campaigns and broader brand marketing. And the reason why this was important is Auth0 was growing incredibly fast. We were acquiring more and more enterprise companies, but the problem was at a very large enterprise, even if, a couple dozen of the developers love you, if the CIO or the CEO or the CTO of that enterprise doesn't know, if they're saying Auth0, it's a really hard upward battle to win those enterprise business, right? So we also had the challenge to invest in brand marketing where we were going to appeal to a wider audience, but not alienate our developer heritage, right? And so we put a lot of work the last 2 years into establishing our next brand halo, which is to a wider technical audience.
Very cool. I love that evolution. It makes so much sense. And it's the evolution. If you sort of have a grassroots brand and you built love among your user community, but then you go enterprise and you keep going up, you need this sort of halo of brand. And suddenly you need, more awareness against more people. But you have this challenge, and I've seen it before, is but you're abandoning us, you're selling out, you're doing these things, and the community will tell you. So again, you have a developer advisory board who you can run things by, and you can let them know, hey, by the way, we're about to do this. You treat them the same way you treat employees, in the sense that you have an inside view of where we're going and why this is so important. Because really, ultimately, the brand work to get the CIO to understand is all to help them. So I'm curious, how did you manage that? Hey, we're getting bigger, but we're not selling out.
Yeah, it's actually a great question. So yes, I will say the first part, testing and research and developer research was critical to all of our brand campaign work. It's always critical in what we do. And we make it's very sure that when we add on these new motions, it's always an expansion of what we're doing and not a pivot, right? It's very easy for companies to feel like they need to make a marketing pivot. It was very clear to us, it's not a pivot, it's an expansion. The second part of how we approached it is, because it was an expansion of the brand, we actually took cues more from the consumer world and the B2C world, and we had a strategy in our campaign that felt on tone with developers and felt authentic to who we are and what our brand was, but in a creative, I think, funny and innovative way that was universal, much more like what consumer brands have to do. So that was the approach we took with our agency.
And talk a little bit about that, because I was realizing we've been talking, speaking of abstract and not specific, specifically, and maybe in the show notes, we'll share a link to, is there a video that you did or something that expressed this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. We have lots of videos and I think they're hilarious. So in the summer of this last year, in 2021, we launched our biggest brand campaign, this universal brand campaign. And the slogan of the campaign was "Make login our problem, not yours." And it's surrounded around all the problems with identity if you build it in-house. And that's a universal problem. Yes, it's a problem for the developer that has to deal with that. It's also a problem for the CEO, the CIO, and for all of these app dev teams. And so I think doing that campaign in a fresh tone and style that appeals to developers, but making the story simple and universal was the key to this campaign.
Just as I break it down, because I do that when I hear lines like this, make login. So we've established the category. This is the community. This is the world that we're operating. Our problem. Okay. So we'll have to define what that is and not yours. So we're going to take this on us, but it's so funny because in so many of these things, it's always sort of, there's this fear, uncertain FUD factor, right?
Yeah.
And there are problems and that's what you're there to solve. But talk about how you were able to take that very simple idea of there are problems, but there are problems, not yours. How do you bring that to life in a way that is not so fuddy, painful? Where was the source of the humor?
So we created an anti-mascot, right? So to be clear, it's not a mascot because it's not representing Auth0. It's the anti-mascot, right? And this mascot we lovingly call Loggie, but it's a comical version of a login box. And what it's personified in the ads, and we'll share these links out, is what happens when app dev teams build identity in-house, right? Versus letting the experts build it. And so I think how it makes it not funny is the tone wasn't so serious. It's quite comical, exaggerated, almost like hyperbolic versions of situations, but these situations are so real in how they manifest for app dev teams and for technology leaders every day, right? And what I see with a lot of B2B brands is we stay away from comedy, right? We stay in the technical, we stay in this solution marketing world of instead of getting to the heart of real problems, we wave a magic wand and say, we're going to make all of your dreams come true. Just buy our product and, our solution will solve it. We intentionally went against that, right? And we just hit the heart of the issues of what app dev teams deal with every day.
You dared to be distinct, as I might say in my book. Love this. Love the fact that there's so few brands out there in B2B that take the Joker archetype and take advantage of it. There's a lot of things in life that you can take seriously, but we really don't have to take everything seriously. It speaks to the importance of likability and humor is a service that we all need. We all need a little more of it. You created this anti-mascot. It sort of reminds me almost of drug advertising, where you create the problem that the drug sort of solves. But Loggie, how many different ways did you execute it?
Yeah, absolutely. This was a global campaign, and there was a lot of, your traditional placements you would expect, a lot of digital advertising, video advertising, and things like that. It also went out of home. So we did out of home physical placements in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, in the US, obviously, and in Japan, right? This fed highly into our social media channels and a lot of our engagement there. And it's continuing on, right? So we use this, what I would say is we use this campaign at the highest altitude of our brand campaigns to tell this universal story throughout the last year.
I love it. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk about results and key lessons learned. So stay with us. Hey, it's Drew, and I just want to mention something completely off the cuff, but we've been doing more and more of it, and I see it keeps working. There's a kind of market research that you can do that can generate PR, that can give you something to your marketing and sales teams to give that is a value to your customers and prospects. It's you do proprietary market research that actually gets at information that is really interesting. It's something that Renegade has been doing for a while now. It's an art form. I got to tell you, there's some really critical steps to make it legitimate research, but still yield newsworthy stories. So if any of that is of interest to you, do me a favor, hit me up on LinkedIn or visit renegade.com and check it out. We've got a bunch of case histories there on market research that cuts through. Okay, we're back, and we only have a couple minutes now, Kerry, but we're going to bring it home. So you launched this campaign. I love all the extensions of it. I've been a big fan of outdoor. It is a way of building awareness and delivering, if you have a succinct enough message, to get a conversation started. So talk a little bit about the results.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I can share is from the previous year, we increased our unaided awareness by 80% year over year. Now, the brand campaign isn't the sole contributor to that. There's many factors that go into an increase of unaided awareness, but we know that this campaign was a huge part of it. We get that data through third-party brand research studies that we do every 4 months. And so we've seen it hold true in the last 2 of the major studies that we did.
Okay, well, you could have started at a very low base, so 80%, so going from, but nonetheless, that's a jump. I'm going to give you credit for that. And obviously, if you're doing a brand campaign, awareness matters. And so did you do some kind of in-market tracking? How did you measure unaided awareness?
Yeah, we did. What we did with unaided awareness, we did a global study of our target markets across all of our demographics, and we've been measuring them for the last few years. So we saw the increases in the ticks in the months following each of the big launches of the campaign. Beyond our research studies, we also saw the biggest boost in our organic social channels, right? So what we saw was our Twitter engagements in the weeks following big launches of the campaign were going up 80%. And the content that our followers and our audience was most liking was this campaign and this comical take, right? So we could see immediately how much our audience wanted to engage with Loggie and this brand campaign as a whole. Overall, for Twitter, as an example, we saw link clicks go up 40% year over year from 2020. And if you look at the Auth0 account, it's not a small base that it's starting from. It's a very large base.
There you go. So, and I really want to emphasize this. This is such an interesting litmus test. The developer community is notoriously critical. They don't wake up in the morning and necessarily, gee, I can't wait to like a company's video. That is not what they're doing. So for them to embrace the campaign and the things and share it is a huge endorsement of its relevance, maybe the element of surprise, and kudos to you. And I can tell you from past experience as a social media agency, several years ago, we had 2 clients within a month of each other launch national campaigns, both of which we could tell were dead in the water on social. And it was so painful as a social agency, because the last thing you want to be is not be able to support the national campaign. This was incredible. So the opposite of that is wonderful, but it doesn't always happen. So again, kudos to you for getting that kind of results, because it really says you understand your community. It's such an endorsement. If they want to share it, that means they identify with it. They feel good about it.
One thing on this really quickly that I do want to bring up, because this came back in our user research, which you were talking about. When we showed the spots to a lot of our developers of research, what they said back to us is, this feels authentic. This feels real. It doesn't feel like the typical cliches and tropes that are about developers. You're not putting people in dark rooms with hoodies, with cartoon character t-shirts. It felt more authentic and real. And I think when you honestly reflect the community that you're marketing to, it's going to resonate better.
I love it. Okay. So wrapping this whole thing up and building this brand campaign against the developer community to sort of build your awareness as you have done, are there any lessons learned that you could share with your fellow marketers, that maybe 2 do's and a don't when approaching this kind of thing?
Absolutely. So the first do is, if you're going to run a global campaign, really make sure that you're thinking about the fact that it's global from day one. We did this, right? But we relied more heavily on this mascot and the visual aspects of the campaign over the words. I think too often in B2B, we rely on the words, right? And that becomes really hard to translate literally globally into a meaningful message, right? The second do that I think we were effective with here as well is keep the messaging simple. You notice when I said it, we didn't call what we do authentication or identity. We called it login, right? Because when you actually getting to end users and people, what do they think about the login and the login box? And so we don't need to use overly sophisticated language to tell a compelling story. The don't that I would say, we rolled this out during a global pandemic, and I think don't get ahead of yourself in the planning. We committed to some out of home placements. And again, I think they were still good, but we committed to them months out when we believed that this pandemic was on the downward slope and that everyone would be traveling and going around. And hey, we learned from that, right? So you got to be adaptable. You got to be agile with where you're going to put the placements.
There you go. All right. Well, Kerry Ok, thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed hearing your journey.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And to the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this as well. Lots of ground covered in the show about from a strategy to understanding your target, to building an authentic relationship with the target, many good things. Anyway, if you enjoyed the show, leave Kerry a note on her LinkedIn profile. And of course, go to your favorite podcast channel and give us a 5-star rating. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neiser. Hey, that's me. Audio production is by Sam Beck. Show notes are written by Melissa Caffrey. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about my new book and the savviest B2B marketing agency in New York City, please visit renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neiser. Hey, that's me. Audio production is by Sam Beck. Show notes are written by Melissa Caffrey. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins. And intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about my new book and the savviest B2B marketing boutique in New York City, visit renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser. And until next time, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.